Welcome, Shani. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. I'm delighted to chat with you today.
No, thank you, Zibby, so much for having me. And I completely identify with the title "Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books." I mean, I think just yesterday or the day before, my wife was like, "Shani, when's the last book you read?" And I honestly couldn't remember the name of the last book I read. I mean, don't even ask me what the last movie I saw was that is not a child's movie. It's just, I have no idea.
We are, as of yesterday, we're trying to go through the entire Home Alone. It's more than a trilogy. There are like 5 of them. I don't even know what you call that. I don't know. Anyway, we're
Yeah,
working our way through the kids' movies as well.
yeah,
But yes, one byproduct, unfortunately, is sometimes less time to read. So
yeah.
anyway, I'm bringing books like yours, which are quick to read, yours, not always on this podcast,
Right.
to people who, or maybe they wouldn't have discovered them otherwise. So I only have a PDF version. Do you happen to have your actual book or not?
I
Not yet.
don't, I don't happen to have my actual book. I mean, part of the reason is I'm in Sao Paulo right now, so it would be a sort of I think a heavier lift to get me an actual copy of it. But like you, I've just seen the PDF version.
Well, it looks great.
Thank you.
Okay, so tell me the whole backstory of this children's book. Have I ever told you Black Lives Matter? Tell me about the illustrations, the people you profiled, how you came to do it, the whole story. How did this come to
Okay.
be?
Zibby, I mean, all of my books begin from the same place, right? They begin from conversations with my kids, and so I wrote a book before this. Have I ever told you that is really sort of a book that is what I wanted to say to my kid, what I did say to my kids, and what I wanted to say to my kids. And that last book I wrote about 4 years ago before the last election. And I just felt like there was a lot of political discourse that my kids were in different ways exposed to. And I didn't want that discourse to diminish who they thought they were. And so that's why I wrote Have I Ever Told You? This book, Have I Ever Told You Black Lives Matter, comes from a similar place. And it involves in part some conversations that I have had with my kids, but also conversations that I've wanted to have with my kids. I mean, for a long time, I've wanted my kids to be aware of all of their history. I mean, I'm, African American. My wife is Nicaraguan. I'm Jewish. My wife is Catholic. I was born in the United States. My wife was born in Nicaragua. We've moved around quite a bit. So my kids have a lot of history, and which is part of, I think, the sort of, palette from which they can draw their own identities. And so for a long time, I've wanted my kids to know more about all of their histories. And one of the histories is Black history, is African American history. And, but, my kids are 6 and 8. And so, I'm not sure, Zibby, how old your kids are, or, but my kids don't usually like to just sit and listen to history monologues by their daddy or by their mommy, right? And so occasionally I'll talk to them about history when I pick up books, but I always felt it was always challenging to me to try and figure out how to expose kids to their history, right? Unless, we happen to go on a trip to Nicaragua, for example, or a trip to a particular sort of African American heritage site. So, so the Black Lives Matter movement happened and is happening, and that it was just a reminder, sort of a similar kind of thing, that I really want my kids to be proud of who they are. And so I wrote Have I Ever Told You Black Lives Matter? And so there are 2 parts to the book. The first half is really an inspirational narrative of, like, a sort of a speech or story that you may want to tell your kids, or they may want to read. And the second half involves over 100 biographies of people mentioned in the first half, which gives really, I think, curious and inquisitive kids the opportunity, right, to ask questions and get them answered about people mentioned in the first half. And another feature of the second half of the book is that there are quotations from each of the people mentioned in the back, each of the people in the biographies, which I think allows kids to be inspired by these people in their own words. And they're really people from every field and endeavor, anywhere from science to athletics to sports. And it's not only historical, but it's contemporary. So you have anyone from Charles Hamilton Houston, right, whose grandfather was a slave and led the legal fight against segregation, to Jay-Z, right, and Beyonce, who are sort of modern day. There are lots of names that you could give them, but business moguls, entrepreneurs, and who inspire people in their own way.
Wow. Yes. That's all amazing. My kids, by the way, are also, I have a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old, and then two 13-year-olds.
Right.
So
Wow.
yeah,
Yes.
so I'm in it with you with them not particularly wanting to sit down for a history lesson. I feel like unless it's a holiday, I can't really get them to focus. Like, why are we celebrating this? So
Right.
um,
Right.
wait, you mentioned that you are Jewish also. How I
Yeah.
haven't met, I don't think, any African American Jewish people before. Tell me about
Yeah.
that.
Well, so my I was basically raised by my mother, by a single mother. Basically since I was 4, so my entire memory. And she's Jewish. I actually don't know what religion my father was. I mean, he wasn't really involved. So so my mom's Jewish. She's my sort of biological mother is a white Jewish woman from Revere, and so the Boston area. So if you hear her speak, you will know that she's from Boston. She says, I mean, the phrase that we've taught our daughter is, I think, I park my car in Harvard Yard. And so my mother has a very, very strong accent, as do, and I'm not exactly sure why I don't, but anyways, so I was raised. I'm not particularly religious, but I was raised, Jewish and culturally Jewish, and so we celebrate the Jewish holidays. And so in our household now, my wife is Catholic, I'm Jewish, so we celebrate both Hanukkah and Christmas, and sort of just because I think that's what I did when I was growing up. I celebrated Hanukkah. My wife celebrated Christmas, so we do that for our kids to expose them to both religions. And it's interesting. We were just speaking with both our daughter and our son yesterday, and I don't know, the topic of religion or God or the afterlife came up, and so I told the kids sort of my view, and Gabby, my wife, told the kids her view. And my daughter was like, she just had this look of, sort of frustration on her face. And we're like, Soraya, what's wrong? And she was like, it's just confusing. And I was like, yeah. I mean, it is very, very, very confusing. But I think one of the points that we wanted to make to her was that no one knows from our perspective, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, what the real, you know, sort of story is, right? What the real sort of answer to fundamental questions, right? Is there God? It's a belief, right? What the fundamental answer is to sort of what the religious sort of history of the world is, right? No one knows, but what's important is that you can believe whatever you want to believe, and you shouldn't judge someone else, right, for believing what they believe. And so that, I think, got across to her and to Matthias as well. Whether there's anything deeper than that got across to them, I don't know.
I guess we'll find out what
Yeah,
actually stuck in 20, 30 years, something like that. We
exactly,
can circle back
exactly.
then.
Yeah.
Well, coming from a mixed race family, did you feel like, do you feel that you also need to tell the story of like the Nicaraguan history to your kids, or like, will you
Oh,
be getting to that book, or is it because this is so of the moment? And of course, there's so much, national, well, not even national, just like worldwide focus on making things more, in common parlance and all the rest.
no, I think so. I have a couple of thoughts, Zibby. So first of all, I think, I've always wanted to, as I mentioned, teach our kids, African American history, and like I always felt like, I'm proud of all of my heritage and who I am, and I want my kids to have an opportunity to be proud of who they are, and I think there are some books that cover children's books that talk about different aspects of every African American history, but I think I wrote this particular book, because I hadn't really seen a book that covered it in exactly this way, right? This sort of breadth of coverage in both a sort of digestible way in terms of the first half, but also a deep and sort of way in the second half that allows kids to explore and can even be a resource for educators, right? So, the Black Lives Matter movement was a reminder and was sort of, and helped, but I think it's something that I wanted to do. Anyways, and I've wanted to do for a long time. I mean, and also, it's a time during which, our kids, as Zibby, being among other things, right, a mom, like our kids, really need us, right? And it's challenging, right? It's challenging to, be the same kind of, you know, solid presence for our kids when we're dealing with this craziness and this pandemic, among other things too, right? So it's a for a lot of reasons, it's a time where kids need us, and so I wrote it not only for my kids, but because I had the opportunity to write it for other kids as well. And so in terms of the Nicaraguan history, I mean, I mean, yes, we have made many stops on that train. I mean, my wife is, a very proud Nicaraguan, as is her mother, and her mother, my suegra, as we would say in Spanish, or sogrina in Portuguese, which I'm learning now, is uh, is also very proud Nicaraguan, and so they are. We eat gallo pinto, right? We eat queso frito. We eat naca tamales, right? Like we are they and so yes, that we are exposing them to Nicaraguan culture as much as we can. I think one of my wife's biggest I don't know if it's a frustration, but I think something that makes her a little sad, is that we can't travel as freely as we would otherwise be able to do. I mean, so far in our lives, we've been very fortunate to be able to travel. But one thing that we haven't done is we haven't taken the kids to Nicaragua. And Nicaragua really is a fundamental part of who my wife, I mean, she spent a lot of time there. She's, very close with the Nicaraguan family. She's fluent in Spanish, right? So that's something that we would like to do more of when we have the opportunity to travel, more than we can now. But yeah, I mean, we want to expose our kids to all of their history. And then, like you were saying, Zibby, ultimately at the end of the day, who knows what they're going to be like? Who knows how they're going to identify? But we just want to give them the opportunity, right, to explore aspects of their identity.
Very true. And not that this is any of my business, but I'm wondering, how did you meet your wife?
So it's interesting. Whenever somebody like tells us their story of meeting, they're like, so I saw X from across the room, and it was love at first sight. And then and they have these amazing stories. So my wife and I don't have that kind of amazing story. We met actually at work. I had been working in private practice as a lawyer in New York, and then I moved to Northern California. My wife was born in Nicaragua, but moved here when she was 4 and reared in Oakland, California. And so she was working so I had been in private practice. She was working at a not-for-profit organization that represented only children, and in different kinds of substantive proceedings, right? And dependency proceedings, and education proceedings, and immigration proceedings, and guardianship proceedings. And so I had reached a point in my legal career where I'd always wanted to do this, but I reached a point where I could well, I was moving to California, and I just thought it was a good point to switch gears, right? To switch from private practice to representing kids, to child advocacy, which is something that I'd always wanted to do. And so I interviewed at this not-for-profit, and I got very lucky and got a job there. And they were fantastic people, fantastic lawyers, and so that's how we met, and we were friends. And then and that's sort of and that's all she wrote. And then we ended up moving to so that's where we met. And then we moved to Florida when I got a job as a law professor at the University of Florida, and we moved to Gainesville, Florida, which I had never thought of at all before moving there, because I grew up in a bigger city, right, Boston, and then moved to New York, and my wife grew up in Oakland, right, and so I'd never really heard of Gainesville other than the Florida Gators, the football team, and I didn't really know much about Gainesville. And then we moved to Miami, and now we're in Sao Paulo for the time being. So
Wow,
that's how
that's the journey. I
that's
love
how
it.
yeah, I mean, so that's how we met. And she's uh, she's great. I mean, she's much smarter than I am. She is an incredibly kind person. And one amazing thing about her is that she's really busy. Like, she's a really busy lawyer, doing high stakes and complicated litigation, but she has an unbelievable ability to, I think, be sort of emotionally available to our kids, which is just, I always tell her, as is the case for many parents, right? You work and it's impossible.
Okay, so I also wanted to know, what plans do you have for more books, or and how you're doing this with your regular job? You know what I mean? Like, you already have a lot going on, and this is such a service you're doing by combing through all these biographies. And I mean, this really, if the fonts were different, this could have been like a huge biography, middle grade type of project. So, but the bios were sort of smaller at the end. So tell me about your upcoming stuff.
Well, so, I think the way that I usually write, Zibby, I mean, I'm not sure, I don't, I don't know how other people do it. I'm sure it's different for everyone. But the way that I usually write my children's books is, I just sit down when I happen to be thinking about something and write a draft. And that's how both of these children's books worked. I guess the second one involved, you're right, I mean, considerably more research than the first. But it was research that it was really even rewarding personally, because I knew many of the people in the book, but I didn't know everything about every one of these people in the book. And so anyway, so what's next? So a couple of things that are sort of in the sort of conceptual drafting stage. And so one is more sort of have I ever told you books from different perspectives, right? Because I think this happens to be a book about African American history, but I think there are many different kinds of Have I Ever Told You books that could provide access to kids to different histories, right? You mentioned, do I plan to expose my kids to all of their different histories, right? Yeah, and I think I'd like to write more Have I Ever Told You books. Another project is slightly different, and so I mentioned to you, I think, Zibby, that I think that my kids are, even though they complain sometimes, maybe a little bit too much, I think they're very fortunate kids in so many ways. And one of the ways they're so fortunate is they have gotten to travel more than I could have ever imagined. And so, they've been to, last summer, because of my wife's job, they were at, we spent about a month, I think, in Panama. The summer before that, we spent about 8 weeks in Buenos Aires, and so another sort of conceptual project is a project that sort of is a children's book that sort of explores the story or path of children who are from traditionally underserved populations traveling, right? So to these different locations and how they experience them. Because I know, I never thought about, traveling in the way that my kids travel. And so one thought was to provide sort of a window and access to other kids, the experience that my kids are having, to other kids through a children's book. So those are a couple of things that I'm working on in terms of how I find time to do it. Zibby, it's really so much fun for me to do. And I sort of feel like, particularly during this time when there is so much going on and we really need to be there as much as we can for our kids, right? It's the least that I can do to try and use this platform to try and speak to kids.
It's amazing. Wow. Well, I can't wait to see what comes next. And it's so funny. In the New York Times today, there was a whole thing, that at-home section. I don't know if you read the Times, but they have
Yes, yeah,
at home.
yeah.
And today it was like,
Yeah.
okay, you're at home with your kids for the holidays. Like, what are you going to do? If you're the type of family who used to love to travel, you can do these things. And I was like reading it like, what am I going to do? So anyway, there were all these resources, to pretend as if you're traveling with your kids, but they all seem pretty shoddy. But having a book like yours would fall into that great category. So no,
yeah. Yeah, I do read the Times. And it's, and I was, my wife and I had the exact same. I mean, we have right now, our kids' school has, wait for it, a 5-week break. So we have 5 weeks, right? And so we had received recommendations from the schools to things that they should do. So for one of my kids, for my older kid, it's 30 minutes of reading 3 days a week, and this math program, which probably takes her about 10 minutes. And then for my son, it's about 15 minutes of reading. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but and I haven't done the exact calculations yet, Zibby, but that leaves a lot of hours during the day, right?
For Roblox?
For what? And so, yeah, I mean, it's, I really appreciate, people working hard to try and help, come up with ideas. And, I think there are things that will take up the time. Maybe we'll do some baking, but it's, it's a challenge. And I think, my wife and I were talking about it. And I think one of the approaches that I take is that, this is really an unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, right? Time, right? During which, and so, so some of the rules that we normally have, I think, are just going to have to be off the table, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, right, my wife and I will do the best that we can to give our kids some stimulation during the day. But at the end of the day, right, they're not going to have as much as we would like, right? And we're not going to be able to do the things that we would normally do. But, as long as, they're relatively happy, they're going to be okay, right? And I think, this is one of those situations where I think, my wife and I just have to continually remind ourselves that, what, let's just put one foot in front of the other. We're going to do our jobs. Our kids will get some stimulation. And, if they watch their iPad a little bit more than normal, it's okay this time, because they're going to be just fine, and because, listen, Zibby, like, I know that I spent a lot more time in front of the screen when I was a kid.
Me
than
too.
people.
I'm always saying that. I'm like always referencing like commercials and shows from the 80s and whatever. And I'm like, I must have been. At one point, I talked to my mom. I was like, did I watch TV all the time? Because I do remember reading a lot, but like there was not a show I appear to have missed. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. You know what? Honestly, all the kids are going to be fine.
Yeah.
We're all going to be fine. And actually, it might even lead to some like course correction on the overparenting.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Because
Exactly.
we all see that, like, you know what? They're fine. Like, they're in the other room, and the world's not coming to an end. So
you know what it reminds me, Zibby, of? It reminds me of, like, when, and I'm sure when your kids are little, and I don't know if you did this, but like you read all of these, parenting books and blogs, right? And people have such strong opinions about what you should do and shouldn't do, and how things will ruin, your kid if you do them or don't do them, right? Should you let your kid cry? Should you not let your kid cry? Should you? And there are but at the end of the day, right? All the kids are fine, right? They're just fine, and it's the same thing now, right? So I really do wonder if this will result in a course correction, because the kids are going to be just fine.
Yeah. And I've realized, and I mean, I say this all the time, but the more kids I have, the more I realize that I have like nothing to do with how they turn out.
Right.
Like all I
Right.
can do is mess them
Right.
up. But
Right.
they are who they are, and
Yep.
from day one. And I'm just
Yep.
like, who did I get?
Yep.
As long as
That's
I
right.
love them and make sure that there's some boundaries and I'm not mean, and
That's right.
loving parent, kids are
Yeah.
gonna be okay. So
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, all this philosophical parenting talk, I didn't see this coming, but anyway, well, thank you for coming on my podcast. Thank you for your book. I can't wait to get a hard copy to read to my kids who, despite all their time on screens, somehow don't like to read books on screens, of all the things, right?
That's funny.
So anyway, well, I'm jealous of you being in Brazil, and I hope you survive these 5 weeks.
Yeah, you too, Zibby. Thank you so much for having me. And if it makes you feel better, yes, we are in Brazil, but just like you, I am inside. So we could be anywhere right now.
That's
So,
true. Yeah.
but good luck, Zibby, to
You
you, and
too.
in this next 5 weeks. And thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming on. Okay,
Bye.
take care. Bye-bye.